Well, I'm a Christian, and I don't know where to start. I'm just glad I got on the air.
Sounds like you started.
Congrats on your 1000th episode.
Thank you.
That's got to be exciting. Well, I wanted to start with something Jesus said in John 14:26. He says, "The Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." I think what he's making a reference to is that the four Gospels will be written this way.
Oh, okay.
And when we look at John 16:13, he's making a reference to the epistles and the book of Revelations when he says, "But when he, the Spirit of truth, come, he will guide you into all truth."
So you found some verses and you have an interpretation that suggests that they're pointing to the Gospels and the Revelation of John.
Yes.
Okay. I don't understand what value that is, because somebody else could come up with another interpretation that they're pointing to something else. But even if you're correct, for somebody to say, I mean, Jesus could have literally said, by the way, after I'm gone, there'll be some letters written about me. There's nothing remarkable about that. There's nothing that points to the divine. And, so I have no reason, until somebody gives me a reason to believe that the Bible is authoritative, that is something that I should pay attention to, I have no reason to pay attention to it. I mean, I do, because I'm constantly talking to the people who believe it. But I don't know, maybe I just don't understand what point you're trying to get to.
Well, there's got to be there's a reason for the four Gospels, the way they're written.
Yes, people believed something and they wrote it down.
Well, Matthew is written specifically for the Jews, because when you look at the first miracle he did, leprosy, he cleansed the leper, and that in ancient Israel, it was viewed as a punishment for sin.
Yeah, so Matthew is over the top for the Jews. So Luke was most likely written first, and Matthew and Mark generally are viewed as adopting things from, Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke are generally viewed as adopting things from Mark, as well as potentially a Q document or whatever, depending on which model you want. But Matthew made everything Jewish. Matthew sought out to make it appear that Jesus answered all sorts of prophecy, and goes back and even references things in the Old Testament, the Torah and the Tanakh, that aren't even there or aren't in the versions that we have. So if we're in agreement that Matthew is constructed specifically to spin this story so that it would be appealing for the Jews, what conclusion can we reach from that?
Well, I'm not saying each gospel has a specific purpose, I think.
Do you think it's important the Gospels be congruous? Do you think the Gospels should line up and agree with each other?
Well, John doesn't line up with the other three.
My question is, do you think that the four Gospels should line up with each other and agree?
Well, some of them have, not all of them have the same stories on them.
All right. The stories covered by each of the four Gospels, would you expect those stories in God's perfect word to agree?
It depends, because we have four different authors. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses.
No.
And go ahead.
We have no idea who any of the authors of any of the Gospels were, but the bulk of scholarship doesn't identify any Gospel author as an eyewitness.
And it looks like Mark had two, if not three authors, I believe. And in fact, Mark, I think, has two, if not three endings.
Then there's secret ending, and then there's the one that ends at 16:9 and then continues.
Back at the beginning of the call, you said something interesting and you made 2 points, and you said, I think this verse says this. And then you said, well, I think this verse says that. Do you find it odd? Do you think it's if you were listening to somebody who was speaking about the Quran and they were reciting a verse that was supposed to be absolutely true, 100% divinely inspired and authored in accord with God's will, and you started the sentence about that verse with, I think. What do you say? I mean, does that sound right? Do you think we as human beings should be interpreting, or do you think the message should be clear? And you don't have to say, I think. You can say, I know the verse means this.
Well, I guess I should have said I know then.
So you know, without a shadow of it, in your mind, that these verses have a specific intent and meaning?
Yes, without question.
Okay. How do you know that? And because a minute ago, I think instead of correcting, I think if I'd have asked, you probably would have said that you know that Matthew and John were written by eyewitnesses.
Correct.
And yet they weren't, or there's no reason to think they are because we don't know who wrote them.
Well, we know, well, there are other, I don't know where to go with this. Mark's getting it from Peter, and Luke is getting it from Paul.
Okay. I'd ask how you know that, but the thing is, if you go look at the bulk of scholarship related to the authorship, even just within the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are anonymous gospels. There's no mention within them of who wrote them.
And they're written in the third person.
John just says, John, a disciple of Jesus. So the only reason it gets that name is because it's self-referential, but you have no idea which John that is. And the best scholarly dating of these things put them decades, even as much as a century after the events that they're talking about. So if you look at those, and we don't know who wrote them, I don't know how you could say that they were eyewitnesses when the best dating puts it in a position where they're not eyewitnesses, and they're not written as if they're eyewitnesses. And if Matthew and Luke are eyewitnesses, or if Matthew's an eyewitness, he doesn't have to borrow anything from another gospel. If Seth and I go see the same show, I don't have to read Seth's review of it, edit out clips from Seth's review, and then add my own embellishments on top of it. I can just tell you what I saw.
Well, we found the pool of Bethesda in John 5:2. We found the pool of Siloam in John 9:7. And we found the ossuary of Caiaphas, which was in Matthew 26:57 and John 18:13. So we're finding archaeological evidence every day.
Archaeological evidence of what?
Of the stories in the Bible.
No, okay. So the position here is not the Bible is a fiction and nothing in there is real or mentioned. I mean, they talk about Jesus going into Jerusalem. We know Jerusalem's real. We don't even need archaeology for that. You can't. How do you find archaeological evidence for first of all, that would confirm authorship and your view that these were eyewitnesses? But how do you find archaeological evidence that supports miracle claims or anything that would get to whether or not Jesus is divine? I mean, Russell years ago.
The Bible.
What's that?
Go ahead.
I was just saying, Russell years ago in the show came up with an example that all of us have used, which is, in 1,000 years, if archaeologists dig up New York City, that doesn't tell us whether or not Spider-Man was real.
I guess that makes sense. But when you look at all the books of the Bible, we got 66 books.
In the Protestant Bible, yeah.
Yeah. Written by 40 authors over 1,500 years.
Written by an unknown number of authors, but it's probably around that, over many, many years, yeah.
But the main theme is Paradise Created, Paradise Lost, and Paradise Restored.
Okay, so why don't we just read Milton and throw the Bible out?
Read Basics Storytelling 101.
Yeah, let's go through and read Joseph Campbell's series on myth stuff. I mean, the fact that the Bible has a narrative that is common to humanity that shows up all over the place, to me would seem to be evidence that there's absolutely nothing remarkable about it, that this is the sort of thing that we find.
Well, when you look at what Jesus said in John 3:12, he said, if I told you earthly things and you don't believe them, how can you believe heavenly things?
Well, first of all, Jesus has not shown me anything, earthly or otherwise.
Well, when you just look at the book of Job, all the science in there.
All the science. Okay, now we're tap dancing on something else.
Wait, how do we get Jesus into the book of Job? That was a little bit of a leap for me.
Yeah, and the science in Job.
I wanted to change the subject. Yeah.
Well, I can understand that, but I want to come back, if I may.
All right, go ahead.
If we're we have the Gospels. And if the Gospels are divinely inspired, God's perfect word, instruction manual for all of humanity, and the Gospels disagree, and I'm guessing on this show you must have covered it 1,000 times. I don't want to cover too much old ground, but I mean, the basics disagree with each other. How Jesus lived, where he went, what he said, what he didn't say, how he died, his resurrection. There are 4 different conflicting versions of the empty tomb story in the Gospel. In the Gospels, the 4 Gospels. So if we know the Gospels disagree with each other and can't be trusted to agree with each other on something that is supposedly a perfect truth, do you think we have good cause then to have real doubt about anything else that the Gospels or any other biblical book might say or state or claim?
Well, we found the Nazareth inscription, which right after Jesus died, they made it basically a capital offense to steal from a tomb. So that's a good piece of evidence right there.
A good piece of evidence for what?
That they did not have an explanation for why the tomb was empty.
Okay, so I haven't looked up this story. I have no idea about the veracity of it, but I can tell you that a report that a law changed about grave robbing isn't confirmation of an empty tomb or a missing body or somebody rising from the dead that is specific to any of these stories.
And would Jesus have subjected himself to the natural law in place when he was bending the laws of the natural world to be the Savior? He would have done it his way anyway.
I hear you.
I mean, the thing is, I always try to remove yourself from, and I'm not saying, well, you can do this, but it's difficult. Remove yourself from saying, I believe this, and then looking at all the things that seem to support what you believe. And instead, look at it, you know, John Loftus's outsider test for faith. If you didn't believe, what would it take to convince you? And if the claim is that there was an itinerant Jewish rabbi that said things, okay, that's a completely mundane claim. I'm fine with the fact that there were probably a bunch of those, probably a lot of them named Yeshua even. But if the claim is that there was an individual who raised the dead, turned water to wine, healed the sick and the blind, gave these passionate messages, was killed as a heretic, and then rose from the dead and ascended to heaven, those are extraordinary claims. And they require more than the story, especially when you have multiple stories with different accounts. Even if all of them lined up perfectly and said in roughly different words exactly the same thing, that's still not sufficient evidence for this. And if that was the standard by which you felt that you could be reasonably convinced of something, then you would have to believe every alien abduction scenario that comes along. Some of those are far more similar than other things. You would have to believe. You would have to accept multiple different religions because your standard doesn't get you to which one of these is right, if any. It's just, this is the one I'm convinced of. And now it just becomes nothing more than well, I believe it and blah, blah, blah. It's an opinion.
Well, when we look at the Gospel of Luke, he was a physician, and he's the only one that mentions hematidrosis, which is blood sweating, which is very rare, the most rare condition on earth. I found that fascinating that he mentioned that in the Gospel of Luke.
Well, I think it's fascinating too, because he described a condition, an event that happened. If people were being crucified and bled out, don't you think that would be happening to all of them or a good many of them?
No, well, this was before, when he was praying in the garden, right before he was crucified.
You're talking about sweating blood, not bleeding water. Okay.
Yeah, he was sweating blood, and it's actually a rare condition. It's there's a couple people on Earth that have it, but it's a rare condition. It's one of the most rare conditions.
Okay, so a rather rare condition gets reported. What does that have to do with whether or not the individual is divine?
Well, it mostly happens in death row inmates, and this was the night before he was crucified. I think that's pretty cool.
Okay, so other people on the planet who are on death row have sweated blood. So it's an entirely mundane occurrence. It may be rare, But the death row inmates that sweated blood, they're not God incarnate, are they?
No, but they're going to be killed just like Jesus was.
So what? The point is, there's nothing about that that should lead anyone to believe that they're divine. I have no problem with the notion that somebody got killed. I have no problem. Well, I mean, I object to the killing. I'm saying I don't have any problem. But, you know, I could grant that Jesus existed, that he said things, that he was killed. And that gets us nowhere near whether or not he was raised from the dead and ascended to heaven because he's God.
I hear you. And I wanted to explain what I've been told about Abraham and Isaac.
What you've been told by whom?
By a preacher.
Okay.
That Abraham is God the Father, Isaac is God the Son, and the ram that is sacrificed is the crown of thorns that Jesus wore in Matthew, Mark, and John.
Cool story.
You believe it because somebody told you?
Well, the Bible.
All right, the preacher told you, or then you went and read it in the Bible, or both?
Well, I've always, that's an atheist objection to the Bible.
Yeah, I have a whole diatribe on the Abraham and Isaac thing, but, you know, preachers, apologists, can do whatever they like to try to spin stories so that they're meaningful to people. But in this one, first of all, I think his analogy fails miserably because it wasn't a crown of thorns that was actually sacrificed. So if the ram is analogous to the crown of thorns, it's not like he put the ram on Isaac and then killed him. So this thing falls apart at every turn. And he's trying to draw a connection between two stories. And my point is, we have no reason to believe that either of those stories are true. So there's a Blackout is one of my favorite shows. And there's a moment where Lord Percy is describing the eyes of the Infanta. And he's saying that they're bluer than the, I don't know, Great Stone of Galveston or whatever it was. And it turns out he's never seen either. And so Blackadder calls him out by saying that, so what you're saying is something you've never seen is slightly less blue than something else you've never seen. And that's what you're doing here with the Abraham Isaac story. Something that is not true and whose meaning may be questionable is barely comparable to something else that we don't have any reason to believe is true.
All right. Thanks for the talk.
Sure.
Thanks for calling.
Thanks.
I'll see you.
Let me throw this out. Look, we've mentioned this before as an example, but if you believe in a literal hell, if you hold to the verse, "Depart from me, all you who are cursed, into a lake of fire and everlasting damnation," or whatever. The idea then is that I'm God's child and I'm in a burning house. And instead of God showing up and communicating exactly who he is, what his nature is, what he wants, what I should do, personally, irrefutably, he writes a letter and then he gives it to somebody else who gives it to somebody else, and he has it translated and transcribed and passed around, and then someone will eventually go and hand it to my child who's on the second floor of the burning house. And I always thought, this to me makes no sense. Why would a personal God not want to make a personal connection that's irrefutable? Why in the world are we stuck with this book that is such a mystery and such a mess? And when people draw from the Bible, it's hugely problematic. So I don't know. I just threw that out there. Does that wash with you? Is it a bad example?
Yeah, no, it's fine. And Ray Comfort, he used to use that example, that basically we're knocking on the door telling you that your house is on fire. And I'm like, okay, but if you knock on my door and tell me my house is on fire and we go for a tour around my house and you can't point to any fire, you're just a nuisance. You woke me up because you're convinced my house is on fire. And I appreciate the fact that you care enough to get me out of my house if my house is on fire. But when we investigate, we find no fire. We find no indication of fire. We find no smoke. We bring in 5 or 6 different people, and you're sitting here telling me my house is on fire when there's no evidence for it. This person's telling me my house is flooding. And these people are going like, no, that's not right. Your house is fine. So the key is to rely on the evidence to reach conclusions. That's what skepticism is, saying I'm not going to accept this until there's good reason for it.